don't forget that Antifa are also victims.
And these are sanctuary cities for Antifa, and people are going to die. We've already had the first casualty here. It happened to be one of these Antifa thugs, but, you know, he would have taken out ICE officers, the guy in Tacoma, the firebomber there. And his associates are people who've been glorified by CNN, glorified by Keith Ellison, glorified by the mainstream media, and it's absolutely outrageous.
Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and now that there's been the first definite culture war casualty regarding the international battle between Antifa and literally everybody else, I think now is a good time to make sure we're the bigger people in this conflict by reminding ourselves that it shouldn't be happening. Yes, of course Antifa are the bad guys regarding the people they're actually fighting with, who are 1. Trump supporters, 2. the Proud Boys, who will defend themselves and others but don't ever randomly attack people, 3. anybody who is against Antifa, 4. any journalists that try to cover Antifa, 5. anybody in our military and many government positions, 6. Republican politicians and citizens of all types. However, these Antifa people are almost unanimously being manipulated by our disgustingly dishonest corporate leftist media, which they oddly seem to get all of their facts from, even though they allegedly hate corporations, and also politicians like the Gang of Four, high-ranking Antifa operatives who are undoubtedly being paid, and whoever the hell is paying them. More so, a huge portion of the people who get wrapped up in the various local Antifa chapters are either extremely mentally ill or are at least somewhat mentally ill, such as the young Asian American woman in Portland who was targeted by her former comrades after she spoke to a police officer about trying to exonerate her innocent friends, which I suggest you read about. But I'll get back to the mentally ill Antifas later. Here's the thing. Antifas don't know almost anything about politics, and not only are they not particularly interested in learning, I know from experience that they more than often become violently angry at the prospect of learning the errors of their ways. Now that Obama's hope has worn off, after he ended up making our nation much worse, all they have left is hatred and white guilt, desperately clinging to an irrational fear of being called racist for not doing or believing everything the squad says that they should do or believe. I mean, Antifas are basically unanimously younger versions of these sad creatures right here.
Because of people like you. Should I be ashamed because I'm Latin?
To your people.
Disgrace?
To your people. Yes, you're a disgrace to the Latin.
And you're what, a staple of the white people? Would you denounce an Obama for starting the cages and everything at the borders?
Denounce Obama? Obama had nothing to do with the cages.
During the presidency of Barack Obama, we didn't see outrage from the Democrats then. We didn't see prominent Democrat members of Congress condemning the, quote, concentration camps and, quote, torture then. Again, President Trump has not built a single cage. The cages you see in the news and on Twitter were constructed by President Obama's administration.
He's the one that created them, though.
No, he did not.
So let me ask this. Do you think that anybody should just come across the border without being vetted?
I don't have a problem with that, actually.
Being vetted?
I don't have a problem with open borders.
You don't?
No.
Doesn't make sense that any human should be treated in a detention center.
Not only do they not know that Obama was a much worse problem than Trump in terms of the safety and conditions on our border, but they refuse to learn. You'll have no chance in hell of getting them to look at a graph like this that explains that the deaths on our southern border have gone down under Trump, and even if they did look, they undoubtedly would say that it's just lies from the fascist government, or that they simply don't care because it was wrong with Obama and it's wrong now because nobody's illegal, even though they only care now, they didn't care then. And here's the thing. Antifas are not only 10 times worse than those middle-aged people who just want to bask in the glory of each other's deep-seated pathological ignorance, but much more so. Antifa is definitely organized, and the idea that they are not a centralized organization simply because law enforcement hasn't been able to figure out who the most important leaders are yet is completely absurd.
I don't know what the holdup is, but I'm glad the senators are putting forward the resolution. I think the FBI has to look at this. I think somebody should be addressing the funding mechanism that funds these protests. When you watch these videos, you see a lot of the same people over and over at different protests. Somebody's funding it. They're doing it for political reasons. Intimidation, threats, and violence for political reasons results in terrorism, and it has to be investigated and charged.
Even if you were to explain to one of these communists that deaths on our southern border have actually gone down under Trump as compared to Obama, despite having more people crossing it now than in all of United States history, they'd undoubtedly just say, well, I don't like Obama. Even though they almost unanimously did like him at the time, because part of being a communist means using perfection as the singular standard to uphold. Thus, since reasonable improvement is entirely off limits to such insular groups of rabidly tribalistic people, they exclusively look up to people who claim to also want perfection and are equally as hateful and angry about our society's lack of perfection. And unfortunately for everybody, they need only look to the Gang of Four in Congress, where Rashida Tlaib isn't satisfied with $15 an hour minimum wage and actually wants $20, and AOC, who just can't stop lying in general.
This was them on their best behavior, and they put them in a room with no running water, and these women were being told by CBP officers to drink out of the toilet. They were drinking water out of the toilet, and that was them knowing a congressional visit was coming. This is CBP on their best behavior, telling people to drink out of the toilet.
The funny part about that lie is how close it is to the truth, to the point where you have to wonder if she knew, or if she was just communicating with and taking the word of somebody who didn't speak English very well.
There's also water that is provided in this is a combination of toilet and sink, and the sink provides fresh water. The wall is marked as agua potable, which is potable water. There's nothing wrong with this water. We're not forcing aliens to drink out of the toilet.
Honestly, if I sat here all day debunking every bit and piece of the dishonest narrative that the powers, crooked media, and criminals that be are filling the heads of impressionable young people with, it would be at least a 30-minute video, and Sargon of Akkad already made a great video along those lines that I suggest people watch. However, what I really want to focus on to finish my video are the types of people who are being radicalized with these lies, because unfortunately, I've known several of them, and yes, not only are they entirely gullible people who pretty much unanimously don't even follow politics, unless you consider itsgoingdown.org to be actual political news, but also, most of them are either regular drug users or mentally ill. For the most part, aside from the young woman in Portland that I already spoke of, this is anecdotal, so clearly you'll have to take my word for it. However, please remember that I've known these exact same types of people my entire life, growing up in the Pacific Northwest, and having lived exclusively in other far leftist echo chambers, while having a music career in the underground scene of numerous cities. These people, in general, don't actually care about what's really happening in politics and never really have. They care about utopian pipe dreams of future civilizations that have never once existed, confirmation bias-oriented rationalizations for why communism and socialism have never been remotely successful, and how it might possibly work this next time if they just keep capitalism entirely away enough, and maybe they make sure that patriarchy is out of the equation or something. For the most part, they aren't intelligent in the least. And while some of them are somewhat non-stupid, their intelligence has almost never really revolved a bunch around actual logic and research-oriented forms of study, but much more so artistic pursuits and things like that. That said, these types of communities are extremely welcoming for people with mental disorders, because for one, people aren't super judgmental in the underground punk scenes or squat parties they tend to hang out in, and even if people might be likely to realize that some of their friends are completely mental and need help, a lot of them frequently take drugs or are alcoholics anyway, and thus don't notice. When these types of groups veer more and more radical and start becoming openly hostile towards individuals with some sense, who are perhaps against unprovoked violence and who want these communities to actually learn about what they are fighting for, so that they learn they're mistakenly fighting on behalf of the billionaires like Soros and crooked corporations like Facebook, Twitter, and Google, which defend the Antifas relentlessly, well, when nobody explains those things to them, the group's psychosis worsens dramatically. I'm gonna tell you a very sad story to finish this video. Once upon a time, I knew some guy when I was growing up, who was a really cool dude when I was a teenager, but I didn't end up seeing him for several years. In my mid to late 20s, I met his sister, who at that point spent a lot of her time taking care of him, as she informed me that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. I ended up hanging out with him once a few months later, after his sister called me to see if I would like to see him, and I said yes. He made music and was eager to see an old friend. When I arrived at her home, he looked almost nothing like I remember. He was much heavier, his hair was frizzy from lack of care, and he had scabs on his face. He was, fortunately, docile and nice to hang out with. We played each other our music off of our headphones, and he was really talented. He really liked my music as well. Unfortunately, before the night was over, I learned that in spite of him lying to his sister about this, he was addicted to opiates because he asked me if I knew how to get any as soon as she left us alone for a while. A few years later, when the Antifa madness started rearing its ugly head in 2017, I noticed on Facebook that he was starting to not just post about punching or attacking quote-unquote fascists, but that he seemed to have a number of friends of similar types. This obviously got me worried, so I began to try to cautiously see what I could do to talk him out of it, but it got me less than nowhere. Immediately, his friends jumped all over me in a social media dogpile, asking who I was and asking him why he was friends with a fascist sympathizer. Obviously, he didn't want the group of violent radicals mad at him, so he immediately denounced me as a friend and assured the group that I was just some guy he knew from growing up. Out of all of the violent totalitarians on his timeline, there was clearly one specific bad actor who might have been one of the local ringleaders in their area. That guy bragged on Facebook about having been to prison for fighting fascists and a few other things of that nature. It was at that moment when I grew extremely worried about my former friend's safety. I messaged his sister, but I didn't hear anything over the course of the day or two that the conversation went on. After a while, I was so desperate that I actually said on his timeline, "Please tell your sister to email me or write me a Facebook message. I already wrote her, but I haven't heard anything." Unfortunately, he assured me that she didn't check her Facebook and claimed that she was okay with his politics and activism. After I made that post, his friends got way more aggressive with me. They accused me of gaslighting him by mentioning that I was worried about him and wanted to speak with his sister, as if that even really makes sense, because the guy literally was a paranoid schizophrenic. It was truly one of the most terrifying online interactions of my entire life, and the worst part of it was that he was thousands of miles away, and thus, I was entirely helpless. When I think about the man who firebombed the ICE detention center, and I look at this story about how he was supposedly a gentle soul, it makes me think of my former friend. He was a gentle soul that had a really great taste in music and looked up to Allen Ginsberg as a teenager. His sister was similarly one of the sweetest people I had remembered meeting during that time period. She had already told me a ton of horrible things that she had been through, regarding times he almost died due to health concerns. Can you imagine how she would feel if he ended up surviving various health, mental health, and drug problems, only for him to end up dying in the company of or from the influence of a radical totalitarian cult that is simply wrong about essentially everything they think they stand for? What I'm saying is, if you think conservatives are the only victims of Antifa, I want to remind you that I have imagined what might happen to him all too often, all too vividly, over and over again since that day in 2017. And it's really shaped a lot of what I do here on YouTube. That's all I have to say for this video. Please follow me on Minds.com and BitChute in case they nuke my channel. And if you could consider donating to me on PayPal, Subscribestar, and hell, even Patreon if you still do that, that would be wonderful. Have a good one and be safe.